Sometimes silence says more than any memory. The silence of the house when I get home from work, the silence of the coffee cooling in the cup no one shares with me, the silence of my name not being called by anyone. I got used to it. I became part of it. At 54, after a life marked more by absences than presences, I learned that waiting can be more painful than losing. So I stopped waiting. I set aside the romantic dreams I was told in my youth, the tales with endings that were never mine, and took refuge in a calm life where everything was in its place, and I no longer needed to step out of mine. The city library became my world, a world of other stories where I could hide without seeming to flee. And so I went on living day after day, like someone walking without a destination, but without the weight of admitting they'd stopped searching. It was on an ordinary afternoon that he appeared, one of those afternoons when everything seems the same, yet the air carries a different scent, like a foreshadowing of change. He walked in as if he already knew the place, but didn't belong. Tall, calm, with the eyes of someone who's seen too much and still chooses kindness. Jonathan Everett. The name came later, but the impact was immediate. Not for what he said, but for what he didn't need to say. There was a kind of presence in him that didn't demand space, but filled the room with a peace hard to explain. He looked at me with gentleness, but not the superficial kindness I'm used to seeing in those who feel pity or curiosity. It was something else. It was recognition, as if he saw me before I even said who I was. For a moment, I fooled myself into thinking he'd be just another visitor, another face, another name that would vanish like so many others. But he came back. He came back often. He started asking for book recommendations, commenting on passages I'd forgotten, asking simple questions that, coming from him, carried weight. And I, Helena Thorne, who'd spent the last 20 years avoiding any connection that could shake the fragile balance of my peace, began to look forward to his visits without admitting it even to myself. It wasn't passion. It wasn't desire. It was something quieter, more mature, more dangerous. It was hope starting to breathe inside me again. And as much as I wanted to resist, something told me Jonathan wasn't just a man who crossed my path. He was a chapter that life, with great care, had saved for the right moment. He never asked about my past, never wanted to know who hurt me, what made me harden, or how many times I almost loved and pulled back. Jonathan didn't come with the haste of someone who wants to conquer. He came with the presence of someone who wants to stay. And that difference, so subtle and so profound, disarmed me more than any pretty words. Little by little, he became part of my routine. He'd sit at the table by the window, read in silence, sometimes look at me as if recognizing something he also carried. He never asked for anything. He just existed there, day after day, with the constancy I'd lacked for years. And it was that constancy, that calm way of staying, that unsettled me the most. I started noticing that he came on the days I was quieter, the days I barely said good morning, the days my eyes betrayed the exhaustion my body tried to hide. It was as if he knew, as if even without declared intimacy, there was an invisible bridge between us. And the most curious thing was that he never crossed that bridge before I did. He waited, always waited. And I, who'd spent my whole life being overtaken, pushed aside, forgotten, began to find a space where I could finally choose the pace. Started talking about books, yes, but soon we were talking about the weather, coffee, childhood, loneliness. We didn't dive too deep, but we didn't float on the surface either. It was as if every word had the right weight, the exact measure. And without realizing it, I started smiling more, staying a little longer at the library even after my shift ended, wearing light lipstick on Wednesday mornings, preparing 2 cups of tea instead of 1. Details, small gestures I only noticed later when I could no longer pretend he didn't affect me. People around me noticed, of course. The little old lady at the flower stand commented that I seemed lighter. My neighbor asked if there was someone new. I smiled without answering, because the truth was still so silent it didn't fit into words. And maybe that's what made it so intense, the absence of urgency. Jonathan didn't want to change me. He didn't want to conquer me. He just wanted to know me. And I was starting to want to be known, truly, for the first time in a long time. It was on a Friday night that everything changed. I still remember because the sky was clear, and the air had that autumn scent that always brings back childhood memories of dry leaves, old coats, comfortable silence. The library had already closed, but Jonathan stayed to help me stack boxes of donations. It wasn't the first time he'd offered, but it was the first time I accepted. Maybe because I wanted to prolong his presence, or maybe because, on that particular day, I didn't want to eat dinner alone again. We worked in silence, as we always did, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was the kind that only exists between people who no longer need to prove anything. Sometimes our hands brushed as we reached for a book at the same time, and I pretended I didn't feel that warmth, that subtle spark. And he pretended too. At least until the moment when, accidentally, I knocked over an entire stack of books onto the floor. I crouched quickly, a bit embarrassed, and started picking them up. Jonathan crouched with me. Our hands met again, and he didn't pull away. Not this time. When I looked up, he was watching me with a kind of calm you don't learn. It was as if he saw me entirely, not just there, kneeling among books and dust, but all the versions of me I'd been and hidden. And then, in a low, hoarse, steady voice, he said, "I waited my whole life for you." He didn't smile. He didn't need to. That phrase wasn't spoken as a compliment. It was a revelation, a whisper that carried decades of searching, silence, absence. And in that second, everything inside me unraveled and reorganized, because I knew with a clarity both cruel and beautiful that he was telling the truth. That while I thought I'd been forgotten by love, he, somewhere in the world, was waiting. Not for an ideal woman, not for a fairy tale princess, but for me. With my scars, with my pauses, with my walls, I didn't respond with words. I just looked into his eyes long enough for him to understand that I felt the same. And he understood. Because when love arrives like this, mature, serene, real, it doesn't need to be explained. It just needs to be lived. In the days that followed, everything seemed the same on the outside. The same paths, the same schedules, the same predictable commitments that shaped my routine with the precision of an old clock. But inside, something had changed profoundly. It wasn't euphoria, not that teenage rush mistaken for love. It was a new silence, full, dense, sweet. The kind of silence that accompanies what's true, the kind of silence that warms. And for the first time in a long time, I felt accompanied, even when I was alone, because he existed inside me now, not as a memory, but as a living presence. And it was strange, comforting, and frightening. Jonathan didn't change after that. He kept coming with the same calm, the same discreet smile, the same respect for my timing and space, but there was a new care in his gestures, a lightness even more visible in his voice. As if, after that phrase spoken on the library floor, something between us had settled. There was no longer doubt in the air, only fear. Mine. And that fear wasn't about him. It was about me, about everything I'd already buried, about everything I'd promised myself not to relive. I didn't know how to be loved like this, with patience. I knew how to be left, ignored, interrupted, but loved with constancy. That was new. And the new, even when beautiful, is also frightening. I started noticing small saboteurs within me. Thoughts that said it wasn't real, that he'd leave, that something would go wrong. Old voices fed by past stories came to remind me of the falls. And it was in those moments that I withdrew. I declined invitations with small excuses. I avoided looking at him too long, afraid of showing everything. That had ever hurt. But Jonathan, he saw and didn't push. He just offered his hand and waited, as he always did. One afternoon he took me for a walk in a park on the outskirts of the city. Nothing special, just old trees, fallen leaves, and silence. And it was there, between a conversation about books and a whispered joke, that he stopped, took my hand firmly and said, "You don't need to run. I came for you, not for the destination." That undid me, because no one had ever given me time, and he was giving me what I'd needed my whole life. Time to trust, time to bloom, time to feel without guilt. And it was on that afternoon, as we walked without a clear destination, that I understood that love isn't a leap, it's a path. And with him, I didn't need to run, I just needed to walk and allow. Allowing was a process, a slow, often uncomfortable learning, like relearning to use a part of the body that had atrophied. It was strange to wake up and know someone was thinking of me before I even said good morning. It was strange to receive short messages like, "Have you had coffee?" and feel my chest warm with a childlike tenderness I thought I'd forgotten. It was strange and beautiful to see someone make plans and include me in them without ceremony, as if I'd always been there, as if my presence was natural, expected. And yet there were days when my mind betrayed me. Days when, hearing the phone, my first instinct was to expect an excuse, a departure, an announced end. Jonathan never gave me any of those signs. But those who've been abandoned learn to anticipate, even if only to protect themselves. He noticed. He knew when I pulled back, even without saying anything. Sometimes I was too quiet. I hid my hands in my pockets, looked away, changed the subject quickly, and he didn't demand. He just stayed. Sometimes he'd sit beside me and say, "If you want silence, I'll stay silent with you." And that undid me, because he didn't want me to be strong all the time. He just wanted me to be me, even when I no longer knew exactly who that was. It was on one of those afternoons of shared silence that my past decided to shout. An email, a name, a short, formal, emotionless message, but it made me tremble. A man who had promised me the world and left me with nothing now said, "I heard about you," as if it were a favor. A man who left without looking back and now wanted to have coffee to talk. I read it, and the ground beneath my feet seemed to give way. Not because I still loved him, that had died long ago, but because that presence pulled me back to a place where I was small, confused, needy. I didn't tell Jonathan right away. I was ashamed of the power that message still had over me, as if I should be stronger, more resolved, more immune. But the next day, seeing him wait for me at the library door with 2 coffees in hand and that discreet smile, I knew I couldn't hide, I told him. Without sugarcoating, I told him, trembling, not knowing why, and he listened, without interrupting, without reacting. When I finished, he handed me the coffee and said, "You don't need to prove you've turned the page. I'm here to write the next one with you." And there, in the middle of an ordinary street, with cars passing and dry leaves rolling on the ground, I felt something release inside me. Because he didn't ask for explanations. He offered me a future. And once again, I understood. It wasn't a love of urgency. It was a love of presence. And presence heals. That night, for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel torn between past and present. I didn't question if I was ready. I didn't replay old scenes in my mind, trying to understand where I got lost. For the first time, I just stayed. I stayed in the now, with my heart whole, with my feet firmly on the ground, with my eyes turned to a man who didn't try to save me. He just offered me a safe place to exist. And it was in that moment in silence, as we shared a simple dinner, in my living room, that I realized I was already loving Jonathan. It wasn't a doubt. It wasn't a possibility. It was a certainty. One of those that don't explain themselves, they just feel. He stayed the same. He didn't change because he felt something. He kept listening to me with attention, laughing at my subtle ironies, giving me space to breathe. But something between us deepened, as if before we were holding hands and now our souls were intertwined. Our conversations grew longer, the questions more delicate. We started talking about the future, not as planners, but as those who allow themselves to imagine. A weekend in another city, a book we might write together, the idea of a house with a porch. Small, almost shy things, but full of truth. I, who'd spent so long not allowing myself to expect anything, was now starting to dream. And the most beautiful thing was that I wasn't dreaming alone. With time, I began to notice how my body changed around him. My hands no longer trembled. When he came near, my shoulders didn't hunch when I spoke about myself. I started wearing the clothes tucked away at the back of the closet, the ones I'd stopped wearing because I thought they were too beautiful for me. I began letting my hair down more often, laughing louder, looking into his eyes without haste. I was returning to myself, and I was returning on my own steps, but guided by his light. Jonathan said, "I love you," on an ordinary morning while washing the dishes. No music, no sunset. He just turned to me with wet hands, a towel over his shoulder, and said as if breathing, "I love you, Helena, not because you're perfect, but because with you, everything makes sense." And I knew that true love doesn't need to be grandiose. It just needs to be real. And ours was. So real it fit in the small gestures. So deep it didn't need promises, just constancy. That day, I looked at him and answered without hesitation, "And I choose to love you every day, with everything I am." And that's how fear lost its voice, not because it disappeared, but because love now spoke louder. Loving in practice is different from loving in theory. In theory, everything seems like poetry. In real life, it's in the mess of routine, the bad mood days, the tough decisions, that love shows who it really is. And with Jonathan, it was exactly like that. After that "I love you" said with soapy hands, there were no promises of eternity or immediate plans for change. What came was simpler, and perhaps for that reason, truer. He started spending more time at home. He left books on the kitchen table, learned where I kept the spices, switched the towel's place in the bathroom, which annoyed me at first but later became a joke between us. Life, suddenly, was shared. And even though I sometimes woke up expecting it all to be too fragile, too fleeting, Jonathan always reminded me, with gestures, with presence, with silence, that he was there to stay. We started facing life together. The small health scares that come with age, bills that got delayed, my sister, who always judged my choices and now was surprised by the spark that had returned to my eyes. He with his traumas, I with mine, but never one trying to fix the other, just respecting each other's timing. There were nights I cried, alone in the bedroom, not knowing how to explain why. Fear of losing what I'd barely learned to have. Fear that it was all too good, and he never tried to silence me. He just sat beside me, put his hand on my back and stayed. Present, without haste, as if saying once again, "I waited my whole life for you. I'm not leaving now." And I, who'd been unrequited love, who'd been a last-minute choice, who'd been a postponed plan. Now I was a priority. Now I was loved with intention. And every small moment shared between us, whether a lazy morning or a walk to the market, was a reminder that yes, love exists. But it doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers at the kitchen door while the coffee brews. There was a day on an ordinary Sunday when we sat on the porch in silence. The world was quiet and the sun was starting to set on the horizon. He took my hand, intertwined his fingers with mine, and said, "If I had to spend another 50 years waiting, I would. Because now I know it was all worth it for this." And I just smiled, because what we had there no longer needed words. True love, even when serene, is tested, and ours was. Not with betrayals, not with doubts, but with something even more human, the fragility of life. Jonathan started complaining of subtle pains, the kind he tried to brush off with phrases like, "It's just tiredness," or "must be the mattress." But I knew, not from what he said, but from what he avoided saying. He, who always walked beside me with steady steps, now took longer to get up from a chair. And when he finally agreed to get tests, the confirmation came like a cold wind. Something with his heart. Not desperate, not urgent, but enough to remind us that time is precious. That no love, however beautiful, is immune to real life. On the way back from the doctor's office, he held my hand the entire time. He didn't say he was scared, but the grip of his fingers was stronger than ever. And I, who'd faced so much alone, felt a new fear. Not of losing him physically, but of losing him in his gaze, of seeing him go silent, of seeing him pull away like so many others. But that's not what happened. He didn't hide. On the contrary. That night, as we ate something simple, he looked at me in a way he never had before, not with desire, not with tenderness, but with trust. And he said, "If I have to face anything, I want it to be with you, because you give me courage even when you don't say anything." I didn't know how to respond. I just moved closer and touched his face, as if holding something precious. And in that touch, without saying a word, I promised I'd stay, that I'd fight with him, not out of heroism, but because there was no longer me without him. We were us. And it was that decision, to be one in whatever came, that guided us through the months that followed. There were days of appointments, trips to the hospital, tests, exhausting waits in cold rooms. But there were also days when love matured. Even more. We never fought, but we began to understand each other's silences with a delicacy only those who've walked through pain side by side know. When he was too tired to talk, I just read to him. When I cried hidden in the bathroom, he'd hug me without asking questions. We discovered that love doesn't need declarations all the time. Sometimes the sound of the other's breathing in the room at night is enough to remind you that love is there. And even in fragility there was beauty. Because love, when it's true, doesn't give up. It adapts. It bends without breaking. And I'd look at him, often with teary eyes, and think it was him. It was always him. What time took, he gave back, with patience, with presence, with love. The end didn't come with fireworks or grand twists. It came with peace. With a certainty that settles slowly, like the sun nestling into the horizon at the end of the day. Jonathan went through treatment. We faced surgeries, medications, harder days, and lighter ones. And with time, his health stabilized. It didn't return to exactly how it was before, but we weren't the same either. We were closer, more complicit, more aware of what we held in our hands. What was once a love that grew cautiously was now a deep root planted in solid ground. There was no longer room for fear, for doubt, for postponement. Love had triumphed over everything, even time. One day, as we arranged books on the living room shelf, he handed me a small, crumpled envelope. Inside was a note in his crooked handwriting, written in blue ink. I waited my whole life for you. Now I want to spend the rest of it by your side. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I just looked at him with an absolutely calm heart and answered, "Then stay, because I waited for you too, even when I thought I'd given up." There was no formal marriage proposal, no ring with a stone. We didn't need that. What we did was seal a decision. We started sharing the same roof, the bills, the days, and nights with the same tranquility we'd shared silence for so many months. And that, for me, will always be the greatest kind of love, the one that arrives, stays, and builds. Today, years later, I write these words sitting on the porch of the house that's now ours. He's reading, his glasses slowly slipping down the bridge of his nose. Sometimes he interrupts me to comment on a sentence or laugh at some memory we created together. And I look at him and think that yes, time has passed, that life isn't perfect, but this love was the truest thing that ever happened to me, because he arrived when I no longer expected, and stayed when everything in me still doubted. And if someone asked me today how I know it was true, I'd say without hesitation, because he chose me with his whole heart, and at the right time. And because when he said, "I waited my whole life for you," I finally understood that love doesn't arrive late. It arrives when you're ready to be truly loved. Today, my love has wrinkles, and my hands do too. But no line on my face is stronger than the certainty I carry in my chest. I loved and was loved as I always wished, with calm, with truth, with presence. Jonathan is here now, stirring his tea with that slowness he says is charm. But I know his care. Sometimes he looks at me and smiles, as if he still can't believe that everything he waited for actually arrived. And I smile back, because I feel the same. We don't live a cinematic love. We live something much better, a real love. Made of good days and silent days, of scares and overcoming, of patience and surrender. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that true love doesn't shout, doesn't invade, doesn't demand. It stays. It waits. It finds. Jonathan waited his whole life for me, and I, without knowing, waited for him too. And now, we live what time always whispered. It was you. It was always you.